International news now.
Okay, so we want to start today with some background on the United Nations, and now we go over much of this material later in the semester, but it's important to briefly discuss it here because much of the current controversy surrounding the United Nations involves its structure and calls for reform of that structure. And so, first of all, let me just say that the United Nations oversees a large bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy is involved in a number of important issues, including peacekeeping, nuclear weapons inspections, children's health, public health, the delivery of humanitarian aid, the protection of human rights, women's rights, a whole wide swath of things. And when states try to secure international political support for some important foreign policy, the UN is there and as a forum for those sorts of discussions, and they appeal to the UN for support. And so, for example, this kind of work on all these important global problems and issues, the United Nations has been involved very recently here in humanitarian aid in the aftermath of a devastating earthquake in Morocco, and was instrumental in rescue attempts for flood victims in Libya. The UN is very active in the issue of migration and refugees through the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, and the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, or UNICEF, which you probably recognize, is a leading humanitarian agency for children's health and welfare. And so whatever its flaws, and we're going to talk at length about these flaws, the United Nations has built a truly global and multifaceted set of agencies and organizations that do what they are, match the mission of the United Nations. It really does try to accomplish some of its core values by addressing all of these world problems through these humanitarian and sort of international nonprofit organizations that pursue these issues. And so the debate over the weaknesses of the United Nations isn't really about all of this work, about what the United Nations does for natural disaster relief or to pursue the health and welfare of children. It's really about how the institution is internally organized, and it's about its internal decision-making processes, particularly when those decisions are in response to international military conflict. And so that's what we're going to be centered on here today. And so Pat is going to now describe the two main bodies of the UN for us.
And these two main bodies are the General Assembly and the Security Council. So there are currently 193 member states in the United Nations, and all of these states sit in the General Assembly of the UN. Because of the wide array of political interests in that General Assembly, it rarely achieves consensus or agreement among all its members. States disagree about how to handle the Russian war in Ukraine, for example, or the North Korean nuclear program. This gives, so when there's a target state like Russia or North Korea in these cases, this gives that General Assembly, gives their allies or coalition partners an opportunity to object to any action against that. So at the same time, though, this universal membership provides a powerful vehicle to secure international legitimacy or political acceptance of some foreign policy action when states can secure broad support within the General Assembly for that action. For example, when the General Assembly voted on a resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and 143 states voted in favor of that condemnation, while only 5 voted against. Again, but 35 abstained. But this still sent a powerful message when the opponents of Russian action could say, look at this vote, 143 to 5. This represents near universal consensus in the international system. Now, the UN also includes a Security Council. Most of its important actions occur within this more narrow governing body. Five states have permanent seats on the Security Council. These 5 states are the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. This preferential access to this unique set of institutional rules is a function of how World War II ended. These were the victors of World War II, and they then set up the United Nations to help them collectively manage the international system in the post-World War II world. All of these permanent members have the institutional power to veto or block any matter before the UN Security Council. Accordingly, this body needs to find consensus before it can act. The Security Council also includes 10 rotating members, but these rotating members do not have veto power, and consequently, the 5 permanent members still have the most power to shape decisions within that body. So for the UN's critics, the Security Council veto is one of the most frustrating aspects of this international organization. The fact that only 5 states, each individually, have veto power on the UN's actions means that a small group of states can block a large group of states from operating through the UN to achieve some goal. Now, this has been on clear display over the last 2 years as Russia has used its veto power to block any meaningful action by the UN to prevent or reverse its invasion of Ukraine. So in the rest of this lecture, we're going to show you how the UN is currently wrestling with its reputation of being incapable on the big issues with respect to preventing international conflict. But we also want you to keep in mind that states still care about what the UN says and does. They often seek UN approval before acting, as the US did before going to war in Iraq in 2003. Well, why do they care? The UN cumbersome decision-making processes stem largely from its near universal membership, right? So the membership provides an opportunity to generate broad acceptance or support for any initiative that can pass. It also provides information about state interests and coalitions on issues. So states will go to the UN to try to persuade, to try and encourage other states to move to their position. And there's a high reward here. If they can convince other states in the international system to support their views in the UN, then it builds global legitimacy. But there's also research that suggests if leaders can go to the UN and build a broad coalition of international support, then their domestic publics are more likely to support their government in that foreign policy initiative. Okay, so there's an interest here in, there's high risks in a sense it can be difficult to secure consensus, but at the same time, if states can persuade other states to build a coalition at the United States, then it generates legitimacy and potentially domestic support for those initiatives. Now, at the same time, so if those are the big rewards, the risks here are it shouldn't come as a big surprise to anyone that it can be difficult to get countries to agree. And so the veto power of permanent members of the Security Council, right, was necessary, right? Why did they create this in the first place? If it effectively allows a series of states to block the UN and make it appear as completely ineffective sometimes. So why did they do that? Why did they agree to this institutional rule? Well, they viewed it as necessary at the time of the institution's origin to gain support and participation of the most powerful countries in the world. This is a safeguard for the United States, France, the United Kingdom, China, and Russia, that the international body can't be continually used against their interests. So they create a safeguard that gives them the veto power that allows them to protect their interests. And without those safeguards, there was a concern that they would have been completely unwilling to operate and work within the UN structure to manage some of the primary global challenges that Rob mentioned before: hunger, poverty, now climate change, refugees, and the like.
Right. I mean, if you're a really powerful country, why would you join an international organization that could be marshaled to stop you from doing and pursuing your own interests? And so it seems like the Security Council and that veto power was necessary at the time, at least, to make sure that they wouldn't opt out. And there was historical precedent, right? There was an historical example in the League of Nations where, the United States, was instrumental in trying to form that idea, but then the United States never joined the League of Nations, in part because of all these worries about sovereignty and control, right? And so it seems like you kind of get an international organization that has problems, making decisions pretty much because that's the only kind of international organization that would have been possible and viable to include all these actors.
And let's draw an institutional parallel here with Congress and the Senate and the filibuster. So
Right.
a lot of people in the United States are frustrated with the filibuster because now you need 60 senators, apart from
That's a good example.
legislation that's related to the federal budget. But most bills within the Senate, you need 60 votes. Why is that? That's designed to preserve the interests of smaller states in the Senate, to give the Senate to balance the Senate's power with respect to the House of Representatives. And so now, right, you'll have lots of senators that say we need to protect the filibuster because this protects the Senate's initiative and balance of power with the House of Representatives. But again, this is an institutional rule that's designed to reassure senators so that their interests will be protected in the long run, and to protect the interest of the minority party. So they continue to uphold the rules is you have to have a higher threshold to enact legislation. It's the same thing. You devise these legislative rules to reassure groups that will ultimately be in the minority that there won't be a tyranny of the majority that perpetually enacts legislation against their interests.
Right. And we just want you to kind of keep that in mind as we go through these critiques, because that's what a lot of the speakers, including Ukrainian President Zelensky, is complaining about, is this veto power that Russia has right now to block any action by the United Nations on the war in Ukraine. And so now that we've provided some background and set up the sort of primary debate surrounding the strengths and weaknesses of the United Nations, we want to bring these questions into the present climate, right? And do so by analyzing some of the comments made at this year's General Assembly meeting. And let me just say that this year's meeting is, in my opinion, marked by a sense of some strong dissatisfaction with the UN, and even a sense that it's increasingly irrelevant in the current, in the face of current global challenges. And one good example that got a lot of media coverage here is that leaders of 4 out of 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, right? And so these are the pillar members that have veto power. But the leaders of China, Russia, France, and Great Britain, they chose not to attend the General Assembly meeting this year. And only then President Biden, the last remaining permanent member of the President of the United States, chose to attend. Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin tends not to travel these days to international gatherings because there's a warrant out for his arrest by the International Criminal Court for war crimes in Ukraine. And so he doesn't travel very much anywhere, especially to places where they'd likely actually execute that warrant, like the United States. Chinese President Xi has never attended the General Assembly meeting, but he has appeared virtually. And so he is kind of one that you would expect to skip as well. So that's not a surprise that the presidents of Russia and China were not there. Now, French officials said that President Macron of France had other conflicts, including hosting King Charles of Great Britain in Paris. There was no explanation from the British government why the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Rishi Sunak, was not attending. But and that's kind of a surprise because this would have been his first General Assembly meeting, and usually presidents like to show their diplomatic chops by going to the UN for these big meetings, but he didn't go. Some suggest that it may be because he's so far behind in the polls that he has to stay home and concentrate on domestic issues. So the absence of these leaders from major countries, and it's not just those 4 Security Council permanent members, but also the Prime Minister of India wasn't there either. That's been seen as a worrying sign for the UN because it's a bad look for the General Assembly not to have these major leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was just going to jump in. This is if the UN is a device that relies on universal membership to build legitimacy for its action. So in other words, other states, they follow what the UN wants them to do because they see everyone is participating in it. But now all of a sudden, if you have main states that aren't participating in it, these are acts that over time could delegitimize and undermine the broader organization.
Right. And so there was, during the Trump administration, he sometimes threatened not to attend the General Assembly meeting. He did, and in fact, we're going to do a clip from one of his speeches. But those sorts of acts do undermine the legitimacy, right, because of this. And so that's a worrying sign. Now we're going to, and so that's the first thing to know. But let's start with our first clip here from the Secretary General of the United Nations. So this is the most visible leader of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres. He's not new. He's been around since 2017. He's been through COVID, saw that through. And as you watch this clip, remember, this is the leader of the United Nations. He has every right, every sort of interest in kind of bolstering the image and the legitimacy and importance of the United Nations. And that's why these comments are a bit surprising, at least to me. So let's go ahead and roll the clip.
Our world is becoming unhinged. Geopolitical tensions are rising. Global challenges are mounting. And we seem incapable of coming together to respond. We confront a host of existential threats, from the climate crisis to disruptive technologies, and we do so at a time of chaotic transition. For much of the Cold War, international relations were largely seen through the prism of 2 superpowers. Then came a short period of unipolarity. Now we are rapidly moving towards a multipolar world. And this is in many ways positive. It brings new opportunities for justice and balance in international relations. But multipolarity alone cannot guarantee peace. At the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had numerous powers. It was truly multipolar, but it lacked robust multilateral institutions, and the result was World War I. A multipolar world needs strong and effective multilateral institutions. Yet, global governance is stuck in time. Look no further than the United Nations Security Council and the Bretton Woods system. They reflect the political and economic realities of 1945, when many countries in this assembly hall were still under colonial domination. The world has changed. Our institutions have not. We cannot effectively address problems as they are if institutions do not reflect the world as it is.
Okay. So I thought that this clip in his speech was a pretty stinging critique of the organization that he leads. He sort of outlines this dilemma for the United Nations, right? That there's numerous global crises, from war and international conflict, military conflict around the world, to newer threats from artificial intelligence or pandemics or refugee crises and immigration flows that seem to threaten stability around the world. And all of these crises are global in nature, meaning they're transnational. They cross national boundaries, and so any one nation really can't tackle these crises alone. They can't do something internally to say, we're going to solve the problem for us and everybody else is going to have to figure it out. They need collective global collective action. And so that's really one of the central arguments in favor of things like the United Nations. So he sort of makes this claim. And then he gives us short history lesson, right, of international relations. He said during the Cold War, for most of the history of the United Nations, there was bipolarity. And in bipolarity, the world was divided between East and West, United States and the Soviet Union. And so a lot of times there was some paralysis there as those two main countries and their allies blocked programmatic action by the United Nations if it contravened their interests. And then there was this brief unipolar moment, right, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, end of the Cold War. But now there's this emerging multipolarity in the world. And he says that this transition, this current moment of transition toward multipolarity, when there's more than two great powers, with the rise of China, you've still got the United States, but then you have Europe as a potential great power, and other countries like India and important countries in Latin America like Brazil or what have you, that this could then be a multipolar world. And he argues that multipolarity does provide some opportunities, that there's some opportunities because power is more evenly distributed across more states, that there could be more voices and greater equality in terms of leadership of international relations. He says, but then he makes this analogy, and this is the one that I want to hear from Professor McDonald, because he's got a thing about World War I. He says, in World War I, that world was multipolar, but it had weak multilateral organizations. And that combination of multipolarity and weak international organizations led to World War I in his perspective, or at least contributed to it. And so he says multipolarity is problematic in a world with weak international organizations. And then he kind of closes with this idea that, look, the United Nations is outdated. It was built in 1945 for a reality in 1945. It hasn't really updated itself, and it really can't serve the role it needs to serve, especially in a multipolar world, of safeguarding the world from international conflict without matching the reality of the world as it exists. And so, do you think this analogy to World War I is appropriate one, Professor McDonald?
No, no, not really. I mean, so for a couple reasons. I mean, the first thing that's striking to me from these reactions, which I read this as largely as a criticism of the United States. If these institutions, and maybe I'm overreading this, and you should push back on this or not, but if he's talking about the institutions needing change, I mean, what institutions is he talking about? I mean, the underlying principles of Bretton Woods and the United Nations, it's not clear to me why these aren't universal. So we want free trade and open globalization. We want to protect sovereignty. We want a collective decision-making body at the United Nations that offers the opportunity for lots of voice and that deals with externalities in the international system. And so, we want to promote human rights. We want to remember 1945, we want to undermine hierarchical or colonial relationships. And so it's not clear to me why these rules, which structure the United Nations and the broader system of global governance, why they're bad. And so, and that's how I read his take, with that we need to adjust the rules, we need to adjust the system because of a shift in polarity, multipolarity, which is really about, what he's implicitly saying is we need to restructure the balance of power, or how these rules protect the distribution of power, so that other states have more mechanisms to limit U.S. influence and its allies. And I'm reading between the lines here, but I want to make sure that we separate, right, from the multilateral system of rules that was created post 1945. There's lots in there that's good, that needs to be, that I think of like a constitution in the United States. Those things don't need to change, and they shouldn't change. So, and I think the comparison with World War I is a little hyperbolic. I hear what he's saying about we need robust institutions of global governance, but I'm not there that without those robust institutions, we're going to get another World War I. We're a long way away from that.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I'm a little bit, I would just, as we tend to do in here, don't be afraid to push back on some of these. There's a lot of things, I get what he's saying, right? That we face a series of new global changes, but it's not always clear to global challenges. It's not always clear to me that when you face a new set of problems, the response has to be to change the set of institutions that have existed for the last 80 years. That's all. In the same way that I would be skeptical of, well, we can't throw away the filibuster. We can't throw away the Constitution simply because we have a new set of challenges facing the United States internally. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, and so there's another clip we're going to play by Biden, who takes a very different approach to the history of the United Nations and the need for reform that is much more laudatory and complementary to the core mission and institutions of the United Nations, that the United Nations is worthwhile. And so the reason that this clip is played and then that one is going to get played is to note the contrast. There's a lot of things you can be frustrated with the United Nations, but the key question you have to ask yourself is, okay, if not the United Nations as it is, then what? And what's surprising to me, at least from the UN General Secretary, is that this critique seems to suggest kind of wholesale changes away from the United Nations, which, again, I kind of agree is surprising at the very least, if not sort of alarming, right? If you got the leader of the United Nations saying this is an outdated institution that needs to be completely replaced or revamped, you might lose it in the process of that kind of process.
And can I add another way to think about this? And if Guterres was here, how would he respond to me, right? So I read that clip as a critique of the underlying institutions of global governance.
Right.
Another way to read that critique was that he was criticizing the current state of great power relations and their inability to collectively manage the system, as was essentially the responsibility that was hoisted on them in 1945. And so they're not meeting those obligations, so we need to rethink the institutions of global governance. And that might be a more charitable way to understand or to think about his critique, rather than the one I said, right? So you're blaming great powers rather than the underlying institutions.
I think, this is a pretty popular take on the UN.
Yeah.
This take is like the UN is outdated and it can't do anything, so let's, you get similar kinds of impulses from other countries, especially those outside of the permanent members of the Security Councils, that say, look, we got to get rid of the veto for permanent members of the Security Council. Zelensky, that's exactly his whole argument, is that the United Nations is crippled because Russia has a veto power. Strip it of its veto power. Now, how do you do that how do you only strip Russia of its veto power? And historically, if you look back, you say, well, the United States vetoed a lot of things that a lot of countries thought needed to be addressed with its veto power. And so, I think it's the core question. How do you go about, if there needs to be some change, how do you do it? So let's move on. And Pat, let's start with you here on this first part of Biden's speech.
Okay.
My fellow leaders, we gather once more at an inflection point in world history, with the eyes of the world upon all of you, all of us. As President of the United States, I understand the duty my country has to lead in this critical moment, to work with countries in every region, linking them in common cause, to join together with partners who share a common vision of the future of the world, where our children do not go hungry and everyone has access to quality health care, where workers are empowered and our environment is protected, where entrepreneurs and innovators everywhere can access opportunity everywhere, where conflicts are resolved peacefully and countries can chart their own course. The United States seeks a more secure, more prosperous, more equitable world for all people, because we know our future is bound to yours. Let me repeat that again. We know our future is bound to yours.
So let me say a couple things here. First, in this part of the speech, Biden re-emphasizes the U.S. commitment to multilateralism. This is a key component of Biden's foreign policy, grand strategy, and the like. During the 2020 election campaign, Joe Biden campaigned on reestablishing alliances with traditional U.S. allies, particularly democracies in Europe and in Asia. He claimed that President Trump's America First grand strategy had undermined the power and the reputation of the United States by shunning the idea of multilateral cooperation with other states. Second, Biden is highlighting issues that are found in the United Nations Charter, but are also values tied to his grand strategy of liberal internationalism, such as child welfare, universal health care, environmental protection, workers' rights, and the merits of entrepreneurialism and the capitalist international order. Thus, he sees the agenda of the United Nations as being in line with the agenda of his administration and the interests of the United States. Finally, the third point is one about change. This is President Biden's second speech at the UN. In last year's speech, he framed his comments around the idea that the world was experiencing a fundamental conflict between democracies and autocracies. He argued that the United States was determined to lead a coalition of democracies to confront authoritarian regimes that threatened the peace and security of the international order. Now, the New York Times columnist David Leonhardt noted that Biden has backed away from this way of describing the world. Don't get me wrong, he is still determined to stand up to authoritarian regimes, particularly Russia, when they threaten the sovereignty of other countries or the human rights of their citizens. However, he isn't dividing the world up into good and bad autocracies anymore. Well, he's not being as public or transparent about this. This is likely due to the fact that the U.S. seeks allies around the world, and some of them, like Saudi Arabia or Turkey, are not democracies. And so Biden is reorienting his rhetoric here, trying to send signals to autocracies that the U.S. has traditional relationships with to ensure that they remain within a larger coalition of states that are tied to the United States, because what he's worried about here is their movements towards realignment with China, Russia, Iran, and the like.
Right. Okay, so that's Biden's initial, statement here that the United States is committed to multilateralism. And so I think that this is a good time to kind of take a step back and take a look at the recent past here and provide a comparison of President Biden's embrace of multilateralism in this speech to the United Nations, even if he's stepping away from this, democracies versus autocracies conflict in the world. And to do so, you only have to go back one administration. Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump, took a very different approach to the United Nations and other international organizations. And so we have a clip here, a short one from President Trump's speech to the UN General Assembly back in 2019. And that kind of highlights the starkly different messages coming from the United States under different presidents. And so go ahead and run that clip now.
The free world must embrace its national foundations. It must not attempt to erase them or replace them. Looking around and all over this large, magnificent planet, the truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique. It is why we in the United States have embarked on an exciting program of national renewal.
All right, so what this is designed to help demonstrate is a couple things. First, the starkly different message coming at the General Assembly of the United Nations from two U.S. presidents. President Trump, instead of embracing multilateralism and saying our future depends on your future and we're all in this together, that was Biden's statement. He emphasizes national sovereignty and states pursuing their own self-interests. And so he couldn't be more different, I would argue, than the message that you just heard from Biden. And you could agree or disagree, but the point here is just to show that the United States in this current atmosphere is really provided with a choice at the next election and a series of different messages coming from the leading, the most powerful country arguably in the world, economically, politically, and militarily still, about how it's going to interact with international institutions. And so Trump argues that if you want democracy, freedom, and peace, you can't get it through multilateralism and global institutions like the UN. It's really secured by independent states prioritizing their national interests. And that's what he tried to chart for the United States. And he, in this speech and to the United Nations, he tried to convince other states that they should do the same, right? And that kind of can be encapsulated in this idea. The quote here I have on the slide, the future, according to Trump, does not belong to the globalists. It belongs to the patriots. And this is an important thing to note, just to sort of contextualize Biden's approach, but also to note that, this isn't necessarily the permanent position of the United States. Biden's approach is, there's a division in the United States about how the United States should interact with international institutions. And every election, and including the next one, will put that division on display and put it up to a vote. And so it's an important contrast to note.
All right, so let's recap what we've covered so far. The UN General Assembly meeting this year has shown some competing trends. On the one hand, there are signs of dissatisfaction and feelings that the UN is outdated or even irrelevant. And yet, President Biden argues that the U.S. is once again embracing multilateralism, which is a starkly different message than his predecessor, Donald Trump, offered. The fact that Trump is the leading candidate in the Republican primary strongly suggests that the U.S. approach to international organizations and multilateralism is still a matter of division and conflict domestically. The 2024 election will provide a stark choice to American voters on what type of grand strategy the U.S. should follow. However, while Biden is still a firm believer in multilateralism and working with international organizations, he also sees the need for change in the UN so it can address the new challenges of the 21st century. So to get a sense of how Biden thinks the U.S. needs to reform, we're going to look at two more clips from this speech. In the first one, Biden praises the UN as a relatively successful organization that has accomplished a lot of good since its inception in 1945. This is an important starting point for Biden and his idea of how to reform the UN. Okay, so let's go ahead and roll that clip.
The generations that preceded us organized this body, the United Nations, and built international financial institutions and multilateral and regional bodies to help take on the challenges of their time. It wasn't always perfect. But working together, the world made some remarkable and undeniable progress that improved the lives of all people. We avoided the renewal of global conflict while lifting more than 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. We together expanded access to education for millions of children. We saved tens of millions of lives that would have otherwise been lost to preventable and treatable diseases like measles, malaria, tuberculosis. HIV/AIDS infections and deaths plummeted, in no small part because of PEPFAR's work in more than 55 countries, saving more than 25 million lives. It's a profound testament to what we can achieve when we act together, when we take on tough challenges, and an admonition for all of us to urgently accelerate our progress so that no one's left behind, because too many people are being left behind. The institutions we built together at the end of the Second World War are an enduring bedrock of our progress, and the United States is committed to sustaining them.
Okay, so why show this clip of Biden defending the UN and its historical record of success? By noting that the UN was formed with the leadership of the United States after World War II, Biden ties the organization to core U.S. principles and values. Biden proclaims that the United Nations was a product of U.S. leadership and hegemony after World War II. He then goes on to defend the record of the UN in furthering peace and human development over the decades, while admitting that it has not been perfect. Like any aspirational organization, Biden seems to be saying that the UN has not always lived up to its high ideals, but it's made progress and provided tangible benefits to the world. The framing of the UN as a good organization that needs improvement, rather than a dysfunctional or irrelevant one, highlights Biden's position as an establishment figure that wants to retain the UN's role in international relations, while also making changes so it can be more effective. So let's now turn our attention to the next part of Biden's speech that calls for change in the UN and other international organizations. In this clip, Biden admits that the UN can do better and needs some internal reforms to tackle today's global issues. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
We also recognize that to meet the new challenges of our decades-old institutions and approaches, they must be updated to keep peace with the world. We have to bring in more leadership and capability that exists everywhere, especially from regions that had not always been fully included. We have to grapple with the challenges that are more connected and more complex. And we have to make sure we're delivering for people everywhere, not just somewhere, everywhere. Simply put, the 21st century results are badly needed. They're needed to move us along. That starts with the United Nations, starts right here in this room. In my address to this body last year, I announced the United States will support expanding the Security Council, increasing the number of permanent and non-permanent members. The United States has undertaken serious consultation with many member states. We'll continue to do our part to push more reform efforts forward, look for points of common ground, and make progress in the year ahead. We need to be able to break the gridlock that too often stymies progress and blocks consensus on the Council. We need more voices, more perspectives at the table.
So after defending the United Nations and its historical record, Biden then admits that the organization has some flaws and calls for changes in the UN and other international organizations to address those flaws. So what are these that need to be corrected according to Biden? They mostly revolve around the exclusion and marginalization of less powerful states. So Biden argues that the United States has already begun addressing this deficiency by calling for the enlargement of the UN Security Council to include more members. Biden also says that the U.S. wants to give more representation to developing countries in the International Monetary Fund so that these countries have more say in how the IMF provides help or economic assistance to struggling countries. Historically, influence within the IMF is distributed according to how much each member state contributes to the fund. Thus, the U.S., as the largest contributor to the IMF, has wielded the most influence over that organization. Finally, Biden touted the recent expansion of the G20 to include the African Union as further evidence that international organizations are evolving to include more states and more equitably distribute power in the international system.
Yeah, so he's a reformer in the classical sense. He wants to keep everything sort of in place. He doesn't want to trash the UN and replace it with something new. He wants to kind of just improve things on the margins. Would you characterize this speech as that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterization. And the problem is whether those concessions are sufficient to the groups that, and it's a tricky bargain to try to find where you make concessions without completely undermining what it can produce. Because make no mistake, these are changes that are designed to alter the distribution of institutional power within the body, which could weaken the United States, but could also simultaneously make the body less effective.
Right. And so, I mean, I don't find the recommendations meaningless or I think they are pretty strong. Note that he also makes reforms that they already have started, right? And so anyway.
Well, and it's significant about, if you still preserve the veto power, then these are marginal institutional changes.
Right, exactly. And Zelensky, in his speech, really pushed ending the veto power, and other states have voiced, and the media coverage on that noted that Blinken, Secretary of State, spoke after Zelensky didn't touch the whole veto power thing, which isn't surprising. Okay, so let's end here with one more clip from President Biden at the UN, and this is a clip on Russia's war in Ukraine. And it was the part of the speech that received the most media coverage, so you've probably seen mention of it already. So let's run that clip now.
Certain principles of our international system are sacrosanct. Sovereignty, territorial integrity, human rights. These are the core tenets of the UN Charter, the pillars for peaceful relations among nations, without which we cannot achieve any of our goals. That has not changed, and that must not change. Yet, for the second year in a row, this gathering, dedicated to peaceful resolution of conflicts, is darkened by the shadow of war. An illegal war of conquest brought without provocation by Russia against its neighbor Ukraine. Like every nation in the world, the United States wants this war to end. No nation wants this war to end more than Ukraine. And we strongly support Ukraine in its efforts to bring about a diplomatic resolution that delivers just and lasting peace. But Russia alone bears responsibility for this war. Russia alone has the power to end this war immediately. And it's Russia alone that stands in the way of peace, because Russia's price for peace is Ukraine's capitulation, Ukraine's territory, and Ukraine's children. Russia believes that the world will grow weary and allow it to brutalize Ukraine without consequence. But I ask you this: if we abandon the core principles of the United States to appease an aggressor, can any member state in this body feel confident that they are protected? If you allow Ukraine to be carved up, is the independence of any nation secure? I'd respectfully suggest the answer is no.
Okay. So, a couple points here. Biden ties support to Ukraine to the core values of the United Nations. And so this is another important aspect of what the United Nations and its mission and its sort of core values represents. So states can use that mission to further their policy agendas and to make a point to try to pressure states that might not have the same interests, but can be persuaded based on values. And so he cites sovereignty and territorial integrity and human rights and tries to frame then this conflict as a conflict over these core values that affects everybody. If you let, as he said, if you let Russia carve up Ukraine, if you let Russia violate territorial integrity of Ukraine, then what state is safe? And the answer there is that no state is safe because that norm has been violated. And so he tries to tie this to the UN. And then he also then notes that the international community, whether they're acting through the United Nations or not, has to hold fast, because what the aggressor here in Russia is counting on is that even if they agree that Russia shouldn't have done that, if Russia shouldn't have invaded Ukraine, if they're against violations of territorial integrity, if they just lose patience and they abandon Ukraine, stop providing support for Ukraine so it can fight against this aggression, then that's exactly what Russia is counting on, is that there's rhetorical support for these values, but not material support and continuing material support. So he's kind of trying to mobilize the international community to continue to do what the United States and its allies have been doing in fueling and funding Ukraine, especially with weapons. And this again kind of brings us back to the original point we had in this segment, and that is that a lot of people are frustrated with the United Nations and its inability to make decisions and its internal decision-making processes that allow one state like Russia with veto power to block any action. But what you can see here in the forum of the United Nations is that Biden is trying to wield that forum to speak to numerous audiences. The U.S. voter is starting to tire of the Ukrainian war. European allies are starting to tire of the Ukrainian war. Non-allied countries that have remained on the sidelines are going to be increasingly calling for a more immediate ceasefire. And he's trying to use the forum of the United Nations and to call on these core values of the United Nations to keep these constituencies on board. And so that's really one of the main strengths, if you will, even with all of the problems that we just touched on, of the United Nations as this forum and source of legitimacy that can potentially change outcomes by allowing states to call on the community that is in the United Nations to try to prevent these kind of acts.
So I gotta add one thing to this. Did you
Yes.
notice how as his speech was crescendoing rhetorically, the core values of did you catch what he said?
I think he meant to say the United Nations, and he said the United States.
And he said the
I
United
noticed
States.
that.
And this is
a problem, perhaps.
This is a problem, right? Because this is part of the broader beef with the United Nations, is that the U.S. and members of the Security Council drive the organization. And in a moment when he was trying to try and build an international community and restate the interest of the international community.
With
He equated,
universal values, not just United States values, but then
but then he equated and took and said, well, these are U.S. interests, and that was
now it's a problem.
He stepped on his message there, right?
Yes.
And
that's a good point to make, because in the coverage of why the Chinese president never goes to the UN was that China claims that the UN is just a Western-dominated institution that, lacks legitimacy, because it's just it's a tool of Western governments.
Yeah.
And that sort of equation between those two helps to further that impression.
Yes.
So,
yeah.
I guess we'll close on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, have a good week. Like we said, this will be released on the 25th. The quiz associated with it will be due on the 29th. And as always, if you have questions, reach out to us. Make sure, as you work through the review sheet for the next set of assignments, talk to someone on the instructional staff. Go do some of the questions. Have a 10-minute meeting with the TA, with Professor Moser, with me. We can help. The more you're talking about this content, the more you're internalizing it, the more you're understanding it. All right? Have a good one, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.